By the end of 1914, as Europe entered its second winter of the First World War, the conflict, once expected to be over within a few short months, had sunk into a deadly state of paralysis. From the shores of the North Sea to the Swiss border, a massive scar stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the continent, an unbroken system of trenches, where men were imprisoned in mud, barbed wire, and constant fear. Modern industry had given humanity machine guns, capable of mowing down an entire battalion in a matter of minutes, and artillery that could pulverize villages from beyond the range of sight. Yet cruelly, it offered no way to break through the very walls of death it had created. Every infantry assault became a brutal test of futility. Soldiers climbed out of the trenches, advanced across the exposed no-man's land between opposing lines, and fell in waves beneath machine gun fire. Tens of thousands of lives were spent to gain only a few hundred meters of muddy ground, only for everything to return to the starting point. This was not merely a tactical failure. It was a crisis of military thinking. Doctrines born from 19th century wars were utterly helpless in the face of the new reality of industrialized warfare. In that context, life or death questions began to form in the minds of a small number of officers and strategists. How could infantry be protected from machine gun fire? How could trenches, barbed wire, and shell craters be crossed without turning soldiers into targets? And more importantly, was it possible to create a weapon that combined heavy firepower with the ability to move across terrain torn apart by artillery? The idea of an armored monster was not born from dreams of domination or from science fiction imagination, but from a deeply human sense of desperation in the face of ever-rising casualty figures. Among those who witnessed that tragedy firsthand was a British officer, not a brilliant inventor in the traditional sense, but a man with the ability to look directly at the core problem of modern warfare, Sir Ernest Swinton. Swinton had been present on the Western Front as both a war correspondent and a liaison officer. He watched columns of young soldiers advance and then collapse under invisible fire. In reports sent back to London, Swinton did more than describe conditions. He began to suggest a bold solution: the use of tracked machines, inspired by American Holt agricultural tractors, armored and armed, capable of crossing muddy terrain while protecting the soldiers inside. In his mind, this was not a vehicle, but a land battleship, able to do what human beings could not. In the hands of conservative minds, such an idea might have been dismissed as a fanciful dream, but history occasionally opens narrow doors for unconventional thinking. In London, amid meeting rooms covered with maps and casualty reports, there was a figure willing to listen to strange proposals not from the army, but from the Navy. That man was Winston Churchill, who at the time served as First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill understood one hard truth: if the war continued in this deadlock, Britain would be exhausted long before victory was achieved. With a flexible mind and a willingness to accept risk, he sponsored the creation of a secret group with an innocent-sounding yet deeply suggestive name, the Landships Committee. Officially tasked with researching naval vehicles, the committee was in fact given an unprecedented mission to turn the idea of a ground fighting machine into reality. Meetings of the Landships Committee took place in an atmosphere that was both urgent and uncertain. There were no precedents, no doctrines, no complete blueprints to consult. Engineers, officers, and designers had to ask the most basic questions. Could a machine weighing tens of tons move across mud? How thick could armor be thick enough to stop machine gun bullets, yet light enough not to overload the engine? And how could such a massive block of metal be controlled amid deafening noise, gasoline fumes, and suffocating heat? The result of the earliest experiments was a crude machine, resembling a mobile workshop more than a modern weapon. It was given a familiar, faintly ironic nickname, Little Willie. Little Willie was slow, prone to breakdowns, and riddled with technical problems. But more importantly, it proved something revolutionary: that an armored, tracked vehicle could cross trenches and shell holes that infantry could not. From Little Willie, development continued under crushing time pressure. Every passing week meant thousands more lives buried in mud. Engineers altered the hull design, lengthened the tracks to cross wider trenches, reinforced the armor, and positioned weapons to fire to both sides. The product of this intense chain of experiments was the first combat-ready version, the Mark I tank. When the MAR, by the end of 1914, as Europe entered its second winter of the First World War, the conflict, once expected to be over within a few short months, had sunk into a deadly state of paralysis. From the shores of the North Sea to the Swiss border, a massive scar stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the continent, an unbroken system of trenches where men were imprisoned in mud, barbed wire, and constant fear. Modern industry had given humanity machine guns capable of mowing down an entire battalion in a matter of minutes, and artillery that could pulverize villages from beyond the range of sight. Yet cruelly, it offered no way to break through the very walls of death it had created. Every infantry assault became a brutal test of futility. Soldiers climbed out of the trenches, advanced across the exposed no-man's land between opposing lines, and fell in waves beneath machine gun fire. Tens of thousands of lives were spent to gain only a few hundred meters of muddy ground, only for everything to return to the starting point. This was not merely a tactical failure, it was a crisis of military thinking. Doctrines born from 19th century wars were utterly helpless in the face of the new reality of industrialized warfare. In that context, life or death questions began to form in the minds of a small number of officers and strategists. How could infantry be protected from machine gun fire? How could trenches, barbed wire, and shell craters be crossed without turning soldiers into targets? And more importantly, was it possible to create a weapon that combined heavy firepower with the ability to move across terrain torn apart by artillery? The idea of an armored monster was not born from dreams of domination or from science fiction imagination, but from a deeply human sense of desperation in the face of ever-rising casualty figures. Among those who witnessed that tragedy firsthand was a British officer, not a brilliant inventor in the traditional sense, but a man with the ability to look directly at the core problem of modern warfare, Sir Ernest Swinton. Swinton had been present on the Western Front as both a war correspondent and a liaison officer. He watched columns of young soldiers advance and then collapse under invisible fire. In reports sent back to London, Swinton did more than describe conditions. He began to suggest a bold solution: the use of tracked machines. Inspired by American Holt agricultural tractors, armored and armed, capable of crossing muddy terrain while protecting the soldiers inside. In his mind, this was not a vehicle, but a land battleship, able to do what human beings could not. In the hands of conservative minds, such an idea might have been dismissed as a fanciful dream, but history occasionally opens narrow doors for unconventional thinking. In London, amid meeting rooms covered with maps and casualty reports, there was a figure willing to listen to strange proposals not from the army, but from the Navy. That man was Winston Churchill, who at the time served as First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill understood one hard truth: if the war continued in this deadlock, Britain would be exhausted long before victory was achieved. With a flexible mind and a willingness to accept risk, he sponsored the creation of a secret group with an innocent-sounding yet deeply suggestive name, the Landships Committee. Officially tasked with researching naval vehicles, the committee was in fact given an unprecedented mission to turn the idea of a ground fighting machine into reality. Meetings of the Landships Committee took place in an atmosphere that was both urgent and uncertain. There were no precedents, no doctrines, no complete blueprints to consult. Engineers, officers, and designers had to ask the most basic questions. Could a machine weighing tens of tons move across mud? How thick could armor be thick enough to stop machine gun bullets, yet light enough not to overload the engine? And how could such a massive block of metal be controlled amid deafening noise, gasoline fumes, and suffocating heat? The result of the earliest experiments was a crude machine, resembling a mobile workshop more than a modern weapon. It was given a familiar, faintly ironic nickname, Little Willie. Little Willie was slow, prone to breakdowns, and riddled with technical problems. But more importantly, it proved something revolutionary: that an armored, tracked vehicle could cross trenches and shell holes that infantry could not. From Little Willie, development continued under crushing time pressure. Every passing week meant thousands more lives buried in mud. Engineers altered the hull design, lengthened the tracks to cross wider trenches, reinforced the armor, and positioned weapons to fire to both sides. The product of this intense chain of experiments was the first combat-ready version, the Mark I tank. When the Mark I was secretly shipped to France, even many Allied officers had no, as the guns began to fall silent in late 1916 and early 1917. One reality became clear to European high commands. The tank had not ended the war, but it could no longer be dismissed as an expensive curiosity. What the Mark I left behind on the Somme battlefield was not a decisive victory, but a strategic question that had never existed before. If armored machines could cross trenches, if they could shield human beings from machine gun fire, then what might happen if they were used properly, in sufficient numbers, and within an entirely new tactical mindset? In the final phase of the First World War, the great powers began answering that question in different ways. Britain continued refining its tanks, moving from the Mark I to the Mark IV and Mark V, not in the hope of creating a miracle weapon, but to gradually eliminate their most lethal weaknesses: underpowered engines, poor reliability, and weak coordination with infantry. Every incremental improvement was paid for with battlefield experience, and often with the lives of crews trapped inside burning steel shells under enemy fire. France approached the tank from a different angle. Rather than building massive, slow-moving machines, French engineers and officers pursued the idea of a smaller, more agile vehicle that could be mass-produced at lower cost. The result was the Renault Fort, the first tank to feature a fully rotating turret, an innovation that would define tank design for decades to come. The Renault Fort did not deliver immediate dominance, but it demonstrated that the future of armored warfare did not lie in sheer size, but in balance between firepower, protection, and mobility. Even more important than technical improvements was a shift in the thinking of a younger generation of officers. While many senior commanders continued to view tanks as tools for infantry support, a small number began to see a deeper potential: the ability to break enemy defenses not at a single point, but throughout their entire depth. Among them was J.F.C. Fuller, who proposed using concentrated armored forces to strike at command structures, logistics, and morale, rather than merely assaulting trench lines head-on. At the time, these ideas were still considered dangerously radical. The First World War ended before any nation could fully test a complete armored doctrine. But the fragile peace after 1918 did not make those questions disappear. Instead, it pushed them into military academies, classified reports, and quiet debates among those who believed that the next war, if it came, could not resemble the one that had just ended. In the years between the wars, the tank became a symbol of contradiction. For the public, it was tied to the horrors of industrial warfare, to mud, poison gas, and unfeeling machines. For strategists, it represented the promise of a different kind of war, faster, more decisive, and less dependent on the mass sacrifice of infantry. But that promise could only be fulfilled if the tank were freed from its auxiliary role and placed at the center of operational thinking. Not every nation was prepared to make that shift. In Britain and France, obsession with defense and the memory of trench warfare led to extreme caution in military decisions. Tanks were dispersed, tightly bound to infantry units, and rarely employed as independent forces. Meanwhile, in a defeated nation placed under strict military restrictions, armored ideas were studied with surprising intensity. German officers, forbidden to possess tanks under the Treaty of Versailles, turned scarcity into intellectual advantage, carefully analyzing the lessons of the First World War and preparing for a future they believed was inevitable. Within that broader picture, the tank gradually shed its image as an armored monster, emerging unexpectedly from the fog. It became a complete concept of warfare, one tied to speed, combined arms coordination, and the ability to strike deep into an opponent's structure. The seeds planted at the Somme and at Cambrai were now beginning to germinate in military thinking around the world, even though no one yet knew the shape of the storm they would unleash. As the 1930s drew to a close, the world once again stood on the threshold of war. And this time, the tank would no longer be an awkward newcomer on the battlefield. It had been studied, refined, and patiently awaiting its role in a far more violent conflict, one in which speed and mobility would determine the fate of entire nations. The next part will explore how armored doctrines were finally put into practice during the Second World War, and why the lessons of the First World War became the foundation of Blitzkrieg. By the late 1930s, the world was no longer uncertain about the future of the tank. Theoretical debates within military academies had matured into concrete operational plans, and the real difference now lay not in who understood the potential of armored forces, but in who possessed the determination to place them at the center of warfare. While many nations continued to view tanks as extensions of infantry, one force chose a different path, reorganizing, retraining, and reimagining war itself around speed and breakthrough. In Germany, where the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles had once forced the army to think rather than produce, ideas of mobile warfare were developed systematically. Among the most influential advocates was Heinz Guderian, an officer who believed that tanks should not be divided up to support infantry, but concentrated into independent formations, closely coordinated with motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and air power. In this vision, war was no longer a slow grinding contest between fixed lines, but a sequence of deep, fast, and continuous strikes against the enemy's command system. When the Second World War erupted, events on the battlefield confirmed brutally the difference between doctrines. In Poland in 1939, and then in Western Europe in 1940, German armored units did not seek direct confrontation with the strongest defensive positions. Instead, they penetrated weak sectors, surged into the rear, severed communications, and paralyzed the enemy's ability to respond. Tanks, in this context, were no longer armored monsters feared for their appearance, but instruments of a new tempo of war, in which time itself became a decisive weapon. The irony was that, in purely technical terms, many Allied tanks were not inferior to their opponents. Some models even possessed thicker armor or greater firepower. But wars are not decided by specifications alone. They are decided by how machines are employed within an integrated system of operations. When tanks were tethered to slow-moving infantry formations, they lost their greatest advantage, the ability to exploit breakthroughs before the enemy could grasp what was happening. The opening weeks of the war in Western Europe saw many military doctrines collapse in a matter of days. Fortified defensive lines, built upon memories of First World War trench fighting, proved obsolete against an opponent who refused to confront them head-on. In that larger picture, tanks served as the spearhead of change, but it was the mindset of mobile warfare that generated true power. Yet the early dominance of armored warfare did not continue in a single, unchallenged direction. As other nations adapted, developed anti-tank tactics, improved weapons, and learned to coordinate combined arms more effectively, tanks once again confronted their limitations. On vast fronts, such as North Africa or the Eastern Front, armored forces demonstrated immense value, but also revealed their dependence on logistics, fuel, and infantry support. With each passing year of the Second World War, the tank continued to evolve not only in form and firepower, but in its role within war itself. From a tool designed to break trench deadlock, it became the centerpiece of large-scale maneuver campaigns and gradually integrated into an even more complex system of warfare, where air power, artillery, and communications were equally decisive. Looking back on this journey, a clear historical thread emerges. The tank was never born of certainty. It emerged from desperation, matured through experimentation, and proved its worth in moments when old thinking could no longer explain new realities. From the mud of the Somme to the sweeping maneuvers of the Second World War, the armored monster reflected humanity's own capacity to adapt or fail to adapt to the changing nature of war. The next part will conclude the story by examining the long-term legacy of the tank after the Second World War and why it continues to shape modern warfare to this day. Part 5: The Legacy of the Armored Monster in Modern Warfare. As the guns of the Second World War gradually fell silent, the world entered a new era, one in which war was no longer defined solely by continent-spanning battles, but by a fragile balance between global power blocks. In that context, the tank, born as a desperate solution to trench warfare, did not fade away with the memory of 2 world wars. Instead, it endured, evolved, and adapted. It no longer resembled the crude shapes of the Mark I or the Renault Fort, yet the fundamental questions first posed at the Somme remained relevant. How could firepower, protection, and mobility be combined in a constantly changing environment of war? During the Cold War, the tank became a physical symbol of military power. Vast armored formations were deployed across Europe, not only to prepare for a possible conflict, but to deter it, to demonstrate that offensive and defensive capabilities had reached a level capable of deciding the fate of an entire continent within a matter of days. Yet the paradox of this era was that, while tanks were produced in enormous numbers and equipped with increasingly sophisticated technology, they were rarely used in the total wars they were designed to fight. Instead, The true test of the tank came in limited conflicts, where terrain, politics, and society were far more complex than doctrinal assumptions had anticipated. The wars after 1945 made it clear that tanks were not a solution to every situation. In dense urban environments, jungles, or guerrilla warfare, heavy steel machines could become vulnerable if they lacked proper support. This did not diminish the value of the tank. Rather, it forced armies to return to a core lesson. First learned during the First World War, no weapon functions effectively in isolation from the broader system of warfare. Once again, the tank had to be integrated closely with infantry, air power, reconnaissance, and intelligence. At a deeper level, the most important legacy of the tank lies not in the machine itself, but in how it transformed thinking about war. Before the tank appeared, modern battlefields were dominated by static defense, where advantage favored those who held ground. The tank shattered that logic by demonstrating that mobility, when properly protected and supported, could overcome fixed firepower. This way of thinking continues to influence how militaries conceptualize the battle space, from the ground to the air, and even into cyberspace in the 21st century. Looking back over more than a century of armored warfare, a striking historical continuity becomes clear. From the idea of a land battleship proposed by Sir Ernest Swinton and supported by Winston Churchill in the darkest days of trench warfare, to modern armored formations equipped with advanced sensors and communications, the tank has consistently reflected the relationship between human beings and machines in organized violence. It is a product of fear and survival, but also of human intelligence and adaptability in the face of extreme challenges. More importantly, the story of the tank serves as a reminder that no weapon exists outside its historical context. The Mark I inspired terror not because it was perfect, but because it appeared at a moment when every existing solution had failed. Likewise, later generations of tanks have only proven effective when embedded within a form of warfare suited to their time. As contexts change, so too does the role of the tank, sometimes challenged, sometimes reaffirmed, but rarely disappearing altogether. In the end, the armored monster is more than a machine of war. It marks the moment when humanity accepted that modern conflict could no longer be resolved by courage alone or by outdated tactics. It demanded a fusion of industry, science, and strategic thought on an unprecedented scale. And within that fusion, the tank has left a lasting imprint not only on battlefields, but on how human beings understand power, limitation, and the cost of war. This brings the historical journey of the tank, its birth, and its legacy to a close. If you would like to expand this into a separate episode focused on tanks in a specific conflict, or dive deeper into a single iconic tank design, just let me know, and we can continue. After the Second World War, many observers believed that the tank had reached the height of its power. In collective memory, the image of massive armored formations rolling across Europe carried the aura of a force that seemed almost unstoppable. But history rarely moves in straight lines. It was precisely during the period when the tank was considered invincible that its new limits began to emerge, not as a sudden collapse, but as quiet fractures forming beneath the foundations of mechanized warfare. Modern warfare after 1945 no longer unfolded primarily across open spaces ideal for armored maneuver. It spread into cities, jungles, deserts, and regions where the line between soldier and civilian grew increasingly blurred. In these environments, tanks designed to confront comparable mechanized forces faced entirely different threats. no longer distant artillery or enemy armor, but compact, inexpensive weapons carried by infantry, capable of piercing armor dozens of centimeters thick. These lessons did not come from theory, but from lived experience. Each regional conflict after the Second World War added another layer of understanding to the relationship between tanks and the battlefield. There were moments when armor proved decisive, but there were also moments when it became a liability if employed incorrectly. This forced armies to re-examine not only tank design, but the philosophy behind the tank's very existence. Gradually, the concept of the main battle tank took shape not as an all-powerful machine, but as one component within an integrated combat system. Tanks were no longer expected to solve the battlefield on their own. Instead, they had to operate alongside mechanized infantry, reconnaissance units, precision artillery, and above all, information superiority. Within this structure, the tank was both a symbol of strength and a vulnerable link if the surrounding system collapsed. At a deeper level, this shift reflected a fundamental truth. The tank is not merely a product of technology, but a product of the context of war itself. As war changes shape, the role of the tank is forced to change with it. There are no longer fronts stretching hundreds of kilometers, as there were in 1916. Yet the same enduring question remains: how can firepower and protection be brought to places where human beings cannot survive for long? In the 21st century, that question has become more complex than ever. War no longer unfolds only on the ground, but across the information domain, in the air, and within digital networks. The tank once created to break trench deadlock must now exist in an environment where the enemy may never appear directly, yet still possesses the ability to neutralize it from great distance. This does not make the tank obsolete, but it forces it to carry demands that the designers of the Mark I could never have imagined. And it is precisely at this intersection between past and present that the true legacy of the armored monster becomes clear. The tank is not the final answer to war, but a testament to how human beings respond when pushed to their limits. It was born when every other solution had failed, and it continues to endure because it can adapt, even as it is constantly forced to confront the question of its own necessity. The next part will delve deeper into the human dimension inside the tank, the crews, the psychology of armored combat, and the mental cost of fighting wars from within sealed blocks of steel. From the outside, tanks have always projected an image of cold dominance. Thick steel, long gun barrels, roaring engines all combine to suggest a weapon that knows no fear. Yet the history of the tank has never been solely a history of metal and machinery. Hidden deep within those sealed blocks of steel are human beings, with all their physical and mental limits. And it is there that another layer of history emerges, less visible, but no less decisive. From the earliest days of the Mark I, operating a tank was an experience far harsher than most outsiders could imagine. Cramped interiors, poor lighting, inadequate ventilation, and almost no effective way to communicate with the outside world defined daily reality. The constant roar of engines and the clash of metal formed an unbroken wall of noise, forcing commands to be shouted across distances of only a few dozen centimeters. Every movement of the vehicle transmitted violent vibrations directly into the crew's bodies, causing exhaustion to accumulate rapidly even before contact with the enemy. Under such conditions, perception of the battlefield became severely distorted. Infantry soldiers could see the enemy, hear bullets passing overhead, and sense their surroundings through every available sense. tank crews experienced something entirely different. Their world was narrowed to tiny vision slits, vague signals, and the echo of impacts against armor. Many memoirs describe fighting inside a tank as being trapped within a machine hurled into violence, where every decision had to be made amid profound uncertainty and limited information. That isolation created a unique form of psychological strain. It was not the immediate fear of being shot, but the prolonged anxiety that at any moment the protective armor could be breached. When that happened, the consequences were often catastrophic. Fire, flying fragments of metal, and sudden surges of heat could transform the interior into a lethal trap. For this reason, trust in the machine and in one's comrades became a matter of mental survival. Across generations of tanks, technology changed, but this psychological experience did not disappear. Whether in sweeping maneuver campaigns or brutal urban fighting, tank crews have always lived with a fundamental contradiction. They are better protected than exposed infantry, yet also tightly bound to a machine that, once disabled, dramatically reduces their chances of survival. That contradiction produces a distinct kind of courage, not recklessness, but the ability to maintain discipline and judgment within a suffocating high-pressure environment. History shows that the effectiveness of tanks depends not only on armor thickness or gun caliber, but profoundly on how human beings are trained to live and fight inside them. The most successful armored forces have consistently been those that understood this reality, investing not only in technology, but in crew cohesion, coordination, and mutual trust. Within the confined space of a tank, individual mistakes can quickly become collective failure. At an even deeper level, the tank has altered how human beings experience violence in war. Destroying targets from within a sealed machine creates psychological distance between the combatant and the immediate consequences of action. That distance can sustain operational effectiveness, but it also raises enduring ethical questions about how technology mediates violence. These questions, rarely discussed openly during wartime, nevertheless linger within the experiences of those who have lived behind steel armor. Seen from this perspective, the armored monster is not merely a symbol of industrial power, but a space where human beings and machines merge in a state of constant tension. The tank does not eliminate fear from war. It simply reshapes it, wrapping fear in steel, engines, and technical procedures. And within that enclosure, the history of the tank becomes a history of how humans learn to endure and decide under the most inhuman conditions imaginable. The next part will expand toward a larger question. As technology continues to advance, will the tank retain its central role, or will it gradually give way to new forms of warfare? As the early decades of the 21st century unfolded, the tank no longer stood alone on the battlefield, as it once had in the black and white images of the two world wars. If at the Somme it had appeared as a strange creature that shook the old order, in modern warfare, the tank's role is defined by something far less visible: data. Information, sensors, real-time communications, and the ability to integrate into a vast combat network have become the decisive factors in whether an armored vehicle truly delivers an advantage. This transformation did not occur overnight. It was the result of a long process of accumulation, in which every conflict after the Cold War raised new questions about the survivability and effectiveness of tanks. In environments where the sky is no longer the exclusive domain of traditional air power, and the ground is constantly observed by satellites, unmanned aircraft, and electronic sensors, tanks can no longer rely solely on thick armor and powerful guns. the risk of being detected from afar has become a threat no less serious than armor-piercing ammunition. This reality has forced designers and strategists to redefine what protection means. In the First World War, protection meant thicker steel. In modern warfare, it means not being detected, not being tracked, and not being isolated from supporting systems. Today's tank exists as a node within a combat network, where its value depends on its ability to exchange information with infantry, artillery, air power, and reconnaissance platforms. That dependence highlights a new paradox. The tank was created to overcome the deadlock of static warfare. Yet, in a data-driven battle space, it can be rendered ineffective if its information network is disrupted. A machine that is mechanically perfect can become nearly useless if it does not receive timely orders, target coordinates, or threat warnings. Here, the tank's limitation lies not in steel or engines, but in the fragility of the systems upon which it depends. And yet, the history of the tank reveals a consistent trait: adaptability. Just as the Mark I evolved from a crude experiment into the foundation of armored warfare, modern tanks continue to change in response to new challenges. Active protection measures, early warning systems, and close coordination with infantry have become integral to design thinking. The tank is no longer expected to be a lone breakthrough weapon, but a flexible center of firepower within a layered force structure. At the strategic level, the tank's continued existence reflects a hard truth: no matter how advanced technology becomes, war still requires a physical presence on the ground. Controlling territory, protecting populations, and imposing order cannot be achieved entirely from a distance. In that context, the tank, with its ability to deliver heavy firepower while protecting human beings, retains a role that no technology has fully replaced. It is no longer a symbol of absolute dominance, but a tool of endurance in an environment defined by uncertainty. Looking back from the trenches of 1916 to the digitally connected battlefields of the 21st century, a clear continuity emerges. Tanks have always existed at the boundary between what human beings can endure and what technology can support. Each generation of tanks has offered a temporary answer to the questions posed by war, and each answer has, in turn, created new and more complex problems. Perhaps that is why the armored monster has never truly disappeared. Its form, role, and meaning have changed, yet it continues to return at moments when war demands a direct fusion of human presence and mechanical power. In a world where data and speed shape every decision, the tank remains a reminder that war, at its deepest level, is still a story about human beings placed in extreme conditions and forced to adapt in order to survive. The next part will move toward a reflective conclusion: what the tank reveals about the limits of military progress, and why every technological advance carries a cost that history is compelled to remember. At some point in history, every major military technology has been believed to end war. Heavy artillery, machine guns, strategic air power, nuclear weapons all once carried the promise that overwhelming force would compel the enemy to submit quickly. Tanks followed the same trajectory. From the moment the first steel shapes crossed the trenches, many saw in them a future battlefield decided by technology rather than endless human attrition. Yet, history once again chose to answer in a slower and far more complex way. Military progress has always operated within a fundamental paradox. Each advance is designed to reduce losses for those who wield it, while simultaneously creating incentives for opponents to seek new countermeasures, often cheaper, more flexible, and less predictable. With tanks, this paradox is clear. Improvements in armor and firepower almost immediately generated anti-tank weapons, ambush tactics, and asymmetric forms of warfare. The result was not the elimination of violence, but a continuous cycle of adaptation in which advantage remained temporary. Within this context, the tank gradually lost its status as an unstoppable symbol and became instead a measure of the growing complexity of modern warfare. It is no longer judged solely by penetration power or armor thickness, but by how it exists within an environment where every movement can be observed, analyzed, and countered in near real time. Mechanical strength, once the foundation of armored warfare, now shares its central role with information, coordination, and decision-making. This shift forces strategists to confront an uncomfortable question: if no technology delivers absolute superiority, then what truly determines the outcome of war? The history of the tank suggests that the answer does not lie in the machine itself, but in how human beings choose to use it within specific circumstances. When tanks are treated as substitutes for strategic thinking, they tend to fail. When integrated into a broader vision that accounts for political, social, and military objectives, they can become effective tools, but never the only ones. At a deeper level, the limits of the tank reflect the limits of military progress itself. Technology can change how wars are fought, but it rarely changes why wars begin or why they persist. Steel machines can seize territory, but they cannot create lasting order on their own. They can protect soldiers in battle, but they cannot resolve the political, cultural, or economic tensions that lie beneath the surface of conflict. It is here that the story of the tank returns to its philosophical, rather than technical, point of origin. The Mark I was born not because humanity believed in war, but because no other escape seemed possible from the meaningless slaughter of trench fighting. Each subsequent generation of tanks carried the same logic to reduce the immediate price paid by human beings on the battlefield. Yet history shows that this price never disappears. It merely shifts, sometimes into other spaces, other forms, and other communities. Seen in this light, the tank becomes a more honest symbol than it first appears. It does not represent the final triumph of technology, but the relative impotence of any military solution when confronted with problems that extend beyond the military sphere. The more advanced the tank becomes, the more clearly this truth is revealed. It is most powerful when used with restraint, and most dangerous when treated as an answer to questions it was never designed to solve. As the world continues to enter new forms of conflict, the role of the tank may continue to evolve, narrow, or be redefined altogether. But the core lesson it carries remains unchanged. No degree of military progress can replace an understanding of the limits of power. And it is in recognizing those limits that the history of the armored monster reaches its deepest meaning. The next part will be the final chapter, closing the journey from the trenches of the Somme to modern warfare, not with a declaration of victory, but with a reflection on memory, responsibility, and how history chooses what is remembered. History rarely ends with clear punctuation. It does not declare winners or losers, award medals, or deliver final verdicts on right and wrong. Instead, history remembers quietly, persistently what happened when human beings confronted the limits of their own capacity. The story of the tank, from its birth in the mud of the First World War to its complex presence in modern conflict, is one such story. Looking back to the beginning of this journey, the image of the trenches of 1916 still carries an undiminished weight. It was a world in which human beings were trapped between industrialized destruction and outdated military thinking, where individual courage was no longer enough to overcome industrial firepower. The tank emerged from this context not as a symbol of ambition, but as a desperate response to stalemate. It was an attempt to reclaim control over a battlefield that had become meaningless and inhuman. From the moment the first steel shapes moved out of the fog, the course of warfare began to shift. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to unsettle assumptions that had endured for centuries. The tank opened the possibility that war could be fought differently, faster, more mobile, less dependent on the endless expenditure of infantry lives. Yet at the same time, it set in motion a chain of consequences that no one could fully control. During the Second World War, the tank became the centerpiece of maneuver warfare, carrying images of speed, breakthrough, and concentrated power. But it was also in this period that another truth became clear. Technology could not replace thought, and material superiority did not automatically translate into lasting victory. The nations that succeeded were not those with the most powerful machines, but those that understood how to place those machines within a broader strategic vision. After the war, as the world entered an era of deterrence, limited conflicts, and asymmetric warfare, the tank did not disappear as many had predicted. Instead, it continued to exist in a state that was both central and fragile. Every improvement in armor and firepower produced new forms of threat. Every technological advance deepened the question of how far military power could go in resolving political and social problems. At its deepest level, the story of the tank is a story about the relationship between human beings and technology under extreme conditions. Inside steel armor, human beings still make decisions, still confront fear, exhaustion, and the moral responsibility of violence. The tank does not remove the human element from war. It merely changes the space in which human beings must exist and fight. And it is precisely this shift that makes the history of the tank more complex than any simple narrative of progress or decline. If there is a single meaning to be drawn from this century-long journey, it is likely not an affirmation of power, but a reminder of limits. The tank demonstrates that every military solution is temporary, bound to the specific historical context that produced it. When that context changes, the role of the solution changes as well, sometimes diminished, sometimes redefined, but rarely preserved in its original form. In the end, the armored monster is neither villain nor hero in the story of history. It is a witness to the desperation of trench warfare, to the ambition of maneuver war, to the limits of technological progress, and to humanity's ongoing effort to survive within organized violence. History does not judge the tank. It merely remembers that, in the darkest moments, human beings created machines like this, not because they loved war, but because they saw no other path forward. And perhaps it is in that act of remembering that the true value of history lies. Not to glorify technology, nor to condemn it, but to understand the choices that were made, the costs that were paid, and the limits that future generations should not forget. From the mud of the Somme to the networked battlefields of the 21st century, the tank leaves behind not only images of steel and fire, but a question that still echoes when faced with deadlock and violence. Will humanity continue to choose technology as an escape, or learn to confront the deeper causes that make war seem unavoidable? That is the question history poses, and the question history, deliberately, never answers for us.